Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 24 of an ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. My intention is for each of these episodes to stand on its own, but if you're like me and you like to have the full context of a story, those earlier episodes are available to go back and listen to in the same place you found this one. Last time, I talked about the rise of dissident movements in the Brezhnev-era Soviet Union and the efforts of the Soviet state to suppress them. Today, I will talk about the treatment of different religious groups by the officially atheist Soviet state. This is The End of History, Part 24. It seems to me like American society, and I'm an American, I can't speak for the wider world, has become politicized to an unprecedented and honestly insufferable degree. Maybe our society has always been this polarized and politicized, and I was simply naive or sheltered from it. But it seems to me that things have not always been like this. I recall growing up and being friends with and socializing with other families and never knowing what their politics were because it never mattered. I only found out later that this or that family had very different politics from my family. This divide never prevented us from not just coexisting, but being genuinely close with these people. I don't come from a particularly religious background, but growing up I had several friends who went to a local, rather conservative evangelical church. I went to their houses for dinner and other activities all the time. They may have said grace at the table or something like that, but they never tried to push their religious beliefs on me, and it was never a bar to friendship that my family didn't share them. I grew up in a world where we lived by the maxim that you never discuss religion or politics at the dinner table, and we very rarely did. These days, it seems like those topics are intertwined in a way that they didn't used to be, and also constantly hanging over every conversation. It's hard to tell in this modern day of social media whether the voices of extreme ideas like religious nationalism have really become as mainstream as they seem, or if the most extreme voices simply seem more mainstream because they're the loudest and frankly the most obnoxious, which amplifies them in the social media algorithm. But regardless of whether it's just a loud minority, these ideas are being projected loudly enough to capture the attention of politicians, and in the United States, separation of church and state and the secular nature of U.S. government, which has been taken for granted for at least the last few decades, are once again at the center of a fevered political debate. If you listen to religious political activists in the United States, particularly conservative Christians, you will inevitably hear someone compare the secularization of American society to the persecution of religion in the Soviet Union. A comparison that bears little resemblance to reality, but nonetheless sparks a palpable emotional response from those who are worried about the encroachment of secular society on religious life. The Soviet Union was a society that, on an official level at least, was not merely secular, but officially and aggressively atheist. When it comes to hostility to religion, there are few governments in modern history that rival it. Yet, despite the top-down efforts of the Marxist-Leninist state to snuff out the religious practices of the various peoples of the USSR, these traditions were too deeply rooted in the culture of the nations that practiced them to be destroyed. Under the harshest of conditions, religion in the Soviet Union survived, and in its own way thrived, becoming a symbol of commitment to principles and resistance in the face of an authoritarian government. The Soviet Union was home to a very diverse array of religious traditions, but the single largest and most influential is that of the Russian Orthodox Church, dating back to the conversion of the pagan ruler of Kievan Rus, Vladimir the Great, also known as Saint Vladimir, in 988 AD. One of the main sources we have for this conversion comes from the Russian Primary Chronicle, a document generally believed by historians to have been compiled in the 12th century. The Primary Chronicle is shrouded in legend, and it's often a better source for understanding the myth of Russia's national origins than it is for the actual history of the period. According to the Primary Chronicle, and this story is almost certainly apocryphal, but it's too good not to tell, Prince Vladimir of Kiev, seeking to find the one true faith, sent ambassadors to the centers of all the great monotheistic religions. When he learned that the Jews had been exiled from their homeland, he decided that they were out of favor with God and could not be the one true faith. His emissaries to the Germans, who were Catholic, reportedly found no beauty in Catholic churches, something that, having been to some Catholic churches from this time period, I find hard to believe. Vladimir also was turned off by the contemporary Catholic requirement of holding services in Latin. When he learned of the Muslim prohibition on drinking alcohol, Vladimir is reported to have dismissed the religion, stating that, quote, "drink is the joy of the Rus," end quote. Finally, he heard from his emissaries to the Byzantine Empire, who were sent to inquire after Orthodox Christianity, and attended a divine liturgy at the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. These emissaries reported to him that they knew not whether they were in heaven or on earth, but only that God must live in that place. Upon hearing this tale, Vladimir was baptized into the Orthodox faith and required all his nobles to do so as well, marking the entrance of the Rus, the ancestors of modern Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, into the Christian world. In truth, Vladimir's conversion to Orthodox Christianity probably had more to do with earthly concerns than spiritual ones. Vladimir's forebears had been Norse traders and raiders, probably from modern Sweden, who founded Kiev and the other Rus principalities as trading hubs along Eastern Europe's extensive river system. Many of these rivers emptied into the Black Sea, at the other end of which stood the global trade hub of Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. Byzantium was their most important trade partner, and the most powerful state in the Eastern Mediterranean at this time. Constantinople was the largest and arguably the greatest and wealthiest city in the world at that time. Baghdad and a couple of cities in China were also very large, wealthy, and influential at this time, but in my opinion, Constantinople in the 10th century outshines them all. Vladimir's conversion to their particular brand of Christianity brought him not only increased trade privileges in Constantinople and a military alliance with the empire, but also marriage into the imperial family, which, though the empire's territory was greatly diminished, still had the global prestige as the royal family of the Roman Empire. It also instantly provided him with a single religion around which he could legitimize his rule and unite the diverse peoples of his empire. In this last part, he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. In the 10th century, the peoples of the Rus were still tribal and loosely defined. The establishment of a single religion, governed by a single church, helped to create the Russian national identity, and to this day, Orthodoxy is considered a crucial part of what it means to be Russian. Even among secular Russians today, the history and traditions, as well as the symbols of the church, carry a special significance for the nation. This significance increased after the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453, which left Russia as the de facto center of Orthodox Christianity, allowing its leaders to proclaim Russia as the Third Rome and take on the title of Tsar, which has its etymology in the Roman title of Caesar. For the next 450 years, the Russian Orthodox Church was inseparable from the Russian state, and wherever the latter spread, so did the former, from the Carpathian Mountains of Eastern Europe to the remote wilderness of Alaska. Interestingly, in Alaska, there are still remote communities where Russian Orthodox Christianity is the predominant religion, and a unique dialect of archaic Russian is spoken. Unfortunately, for those of us like me who are interested in the anthropology of this, these mostly indigenous communities are dying out as their people assimilate into Anglophone U.S. society. When the Revolution and Civil War came, the Church tried to remain neutral as much as possible, but due to their close association with the Tsar, they were seen particularly by the Bolsheviks as counter-revolutionary, and they were to be suppressed and eliminated. This is before we even get to the Marxist-Leninist ideology concerning religion. Even if you know nothing else about Marxism, you've probably heard the phrase, "religion is the opiate of the masses." In context, Marx said this in the context that religion was mankind's way of numbing the pain of existence in an exploitative economic system. His theory on religion is probably best summed up in his quote from his 1843 critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, in which he wrote, quote, "The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions." End quote. Lenin was far from neutral on religion, but he was also pragmatic on the subject. While he was personally an atheist who believed religion to be naive superstition, he sought only to eliminate the power of the church as an institution, which he saw as an organ of reaction and exploitation of the working class. He stopped short, however, of any attempt to force ordinary citizens to abandon their religious beliefs. Nonetheless, in their quest to break the power of the church institutions in Russia, the Bolsheviks were extremely ruthless. There are wildly different numbers presented by different sources as to what the death toll of the revolution and civil war was on the clergy. One source I saw claims that about 1,200 Orthodox priests were executed. Another puts this number at 90,000. I wouldn't be able to give you an accurate number without doing a lot more research and examining, in particular, primary sources that I currently don't have access to. And the truth is, I just have no idea what the true number was. I would be surprised if it was 90,000 because I have my doubts that there were even 90,000 Orthodox priests in the Russian Empire in 1917, but the number may well exceed 1,200 as well. I don't have the answer for you, but as always, if you're interested, I encourage you to seek the answer on your own. Suffice to say for now that the Bolsheviks ruthlessly suppressed the church, and many of the clergy were killed. The church was not abolished, but it was deprived of any official legal status, and crucially, the right to own property. Ironically, rather than separating the state from religious institutions as it proclaimed to do, Lenin's regime actually came rather entangled with the Russian Orthodox Church, as he attempted to control it by making it answerable to secular authority, and limiting the power of the clergy to simply giving sermons inside church buildings, which the capital C Church did not itself own. But Lenin never attempted to outlaw the church completely. He understood that to do so would be deeply unpopular, especially in the countryside among the deeply religious peasants. The early years of Stalin's rule were a time of pretty overt persecution of the church. In his efforts to break the peasants and bring them under his heel, he sent thugs into the countryside as part of his collectivization campaign, who often destroyed churches or requisitioned them for use as warehouses or livestock stables. Such was meant to humiliate and terrorize the countryside into submission. Instead, as I covered in episode 5, this attempted humiliation led to outright rebellion more often than it led to docile submission. Stalin's official policy toward the church was, in some ways, similar to Lenin's. However, Stalin was more openly hostile to the church than Lenin had been, perhaps because of his own negative experience as a seminary student, which I talked about in episode 4. In a 1927 interview with a group of American trade unionists, Stalin said that the revolution had proclaimed religious liberty, as this freedom was a matter of conscience for each individual. He went on to explain, however, that the religious liberty was not the same thing as tolerance of religious institutions. He told them, quote, "The party cannot be neutral towards religion, and does conduct anti-religious propaganda against all and every religious prejudice because it stands for science, while religious prejudices run counter to science, because all religion is something opposite to science." End quote. He went on to say, quote, "The party cannot be neutral towards the bearers of religious prejudices, towards the reactionary clergy who poison the minds of the toiling masses. Have we suppressed the reactionary clergy? Yes, we have. The unfortunate thing is that it has not been completely liquidated." End quote. As with most aspects of Soviet society, the relationship of the state to the church was fundamentally altered by the Second World War. When Nazi Germany invaded and occupied large swaths of Soviet territory, in many places they were welcomed as liberators by the religious population, whose church had been suppressed by the communists. The Germans encouraged the church to collaborate and even made a show of allowing Russian Orthodox priests to visit and preach to Soviet prisoners of war in front of propaganda newsreels. Had the Nazis been less committed to their wild theories and rigid racial hierarchies, these efforts might have been successful in winning over the population. However, the Nazis could not stop being Nazis, and eventually the population in the occupied territories saw this empowerment of the church for what it was, an empty propaganda gesture. Realizing his strategic error, as there was simply no way he could eliminate the church or many people's faith in it, Stalin reversed course and restored the legitimacy of the Russian Orthodox Church. He used it as a tool to foment Russian nationalism and patriotism. Hundreds of churches that had been closed during the campaign of repression were reopened, and the clergy was invited to pray for the life of Holy Russia. The church, steeped as it was in the tradition of Russian nationhood, mostly bought into this and chose to support the war effort. After the war, Stalin never returned to outright persecution of the church, instead finding ways to control and coexist with religion. New freedoms were even granted to the church. They were allowed to own certain types of property, manufacture liturgical objects, and publish a religious journal. In return, church leaders were expected to outwardly deny any past persecution of the church and profess loyalty to the regime and commitment to communism. Anti-religious propaganda kicked back up again for a few years while Khrushchev was at the height of his power, as he was ideologically committed to the Leninist principle of eliminating religion through propaganda, a task which he dedicated a significant amount of resources to. They still officially promoted atheism, but this was mostly done through soft rather than hard power. Religion was attacked in state propaganda as a primitive superstition, but those who wished to pursue this superstition were free to do so quietly. Individuals who were known to be religious were usually limited in how far they could rise. Church members were usually denied admission to the Communist Party, for instance, which was a necessary step for any ambitious person who hoped to rise in Soviet society. Some party members were religious, or at least sympathetic to the church, but they had to keep that quiet. By the height of the Brezhnev era in the 1970s, an unofficial sort of don't ask, don't tell policy had developed within the party as to membership in the Russian Orthodox Church. As long as a party member was discreet and didn't speak about religion in public, they were usually fine. As I mentioned back in episode 20, Brezhnev himself was most likely baptized in the Russian Orthodox Church, though he would have ceased all religious activities after joining the party. He still likely harbored some sympathy for the Russian Orthodox believers, though. The regime also encouraged schisms and heresies within the church. Taking a page out of the book of the last pagan Roman emperor Julian, they avoided creating martyrs through active brutal persecutions, but instead simply stood back and let the church chip away at itself through doctrinal infighting. In at least one way, this policy backfired, as it led to the formation of multiple splinter churches that, without the official state sanction of the recognized Orthodox Church, could not be controlled, and were particularly attractive to subversive anti-government types. Some of these splinter groups, known as the catacomb churches, after the early Christians that had congregated in the catacombs of Rome during the persecutions of the religion, came to be unofficially affiliated with the dissident movement that I talked about last week. The meetings of various catacomb churches eventually came to double as meeting places for political as well as religious dissidents. As for the official Russian Orthodox Church, the state also sought to control it by infiltrating it. There have been allegations over the decades, some confirmed, others credible but unconfirmed, that various members of the church hierarchy, including the current patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, who was previously a bishop and archbishop in the church, were members of the KGB. And it's important to differentiate between informers and assets in whose ranks most of the clergy could be counted, and actual card-carrying members of the KGB. It has been alleged, credibly, by multiple mainstream news organizations that archived documents from the Swiss National Police indicate that Kirill was an agent of the KGB conducting espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union while representing the Russian Orthodox Church at the World Church Council, which is headquartered in Geneva. Kirill's nephew has vehemently denied these allegations, but neither Kirill nor the church have commented on them. But Kirill is far from the only member of the KGB to have reached the top echelon of church leadership. The KGB seems to have invested a great deal of time and effort infiltrating the church leadership to ensure its loyalty and subservience to the state. Of course, the Russian Orthodox Church was not the only Christian church within the USSR. There were members of the Georgian Orthodox Church, which was allowed to separate and regain autonomy from the Russian Church following the revolution and the separation of the church from state power. The Georgian church was controlled and co-opted in a similar manner to the Russian church, as was the Armenian Apostolic Church. Both of these churches have their own fascinating history before, during, and after the Soviet period, and if I ever do a series more directly related to church history, I would love to do more research and revisit the topic. For now, since their treatment by the Soviet regime was similar, they're going to get the short end of the stick. If you were hoping for a comprehensive history and discussion of these churches, I'm sorry. Please let me have it on social media. There were also Roman Catholics in the Soviet Union, which presented a more complex problem for the state because of the Catholic Church's uniquely international and vehemently anti-communist nature. During the time of Lenin, Catholics were a minuscule minority in the USSR, and from what I've read, the early Bolsheviks spent very little time crafting policies on how to deal with the Catholic Church. In 1940, however, following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which I covered back in episode 6, Stalin annexed the Baltic states and the eastern portion of pre-war Poland into the Soviet Union, bringing millions of Catholics within its borders. Stalin was more overt in his persecution of the Catholic Church than he was of the Russian Orthodox Church. When Stalin extended the purges to the newly annexed territories, thousands of Catholic clergy were branded as counter-revolutionaries or foreign spies and arrested, imprisoned in the Gulag, and in some cases summarily executed. Catholicism was simply more difficult to co-opt than Russian Orthodoxy because of its relationship with the Pope and the Vatican, as well as the large Catholic populations in Western countries, so it was more aggressively persecuted. The propaganda against Catholicism also was more aggressive, especially in the lead-up to and during the Second World War. This propaganda played up the complicity of the Catholic Church in the crimes of the Nazi regime and their Axis allies. Soviet propaganda also, somewhat ironically, seized on the long-standing rivalry between the Catholic and Orthodox churches to highlight the hostility of the Catholic Church toward Russians and other Orthodox believers. This had the dual effect of damping down rising nationalism in places like Western Ukraine, where people were united by nationality but divided by religion, with an Orthodox majority living side by side with a Catholic minority, while also painting the Catholic Church in a negative light. All of this comes together in the classic 1938 Soviet film Alexander Nevsky, where we see Catholic Teutonic Crusaders portrayed as evil incarnate, as they are visually associated with fascist symbols like the swastika. After the war, however, persecution of Catholics likewise took a softer approach, as Soviet authorities sought to assimilate predominantly Catholic populations into a peacetime, post-war country. Rather than try to snuff out the church entirely, Soviet authorities applied strategies seeking to control or undermine it, similar to their treatment of the Russian Orthodox Church. They encouraged the formation of dissenting religious movements unconnected to Rome, and encouraged Catholics to join them. They also, recognizing that they could not destroy the church entirely, allowed a limited number of Catholic seminaries to continue training new clergy, but ensured that the curriculum included elements of Marxist-Leninist ideology, and also that a healthy number of covert KGB agents infiltrated these seminaries and joined the priesthood. As with the KGB infiltration of the Russian Orthodox Church, it's difficult to say with certainty just how many Catholic clergymen were KGB agents, but there are enough documented reports of this practice to confirm it was one of the tactics used by the Soviet regime to control the church. To the north, in the Baltic republics of Estonia and Latvia, the population was predominantly Protestant, and mostly of the Lutheran variety, but a few other evangelical Protestant churches also thrived there alongside Catholic and Russian Orthodox minorities. Protestantism is much less centralized and hierarchical than Russian Orthodoxy and Catholicism. The areas where it was predominant accounted for only a very small corner of the massive country, and one of them, Estonia, was already highly secularized. Thus, the Soviet authorities seemed to be far less concerned with Protestantism than they were with Russian Orthodoxy and Catholicism. Their primary concern seemed to be limiting its spread rather than stifling it where it existed. This speaks to the fact that the aspect of Protestant churches that the Soviet regime saw as the greatest threat was their tendency toward evangelism, that is, the attempt to convert others to their faith. The KGB and its predecessor secret police acronym organizations clamped down pretty hard on this. Those caught proselytizing were usually arrested for spreading anti-Soviet propaganda or some such trumped-up offense, or they were deemed insane and locked away in a psychiatric hospital, a popular tactic during the Brezhnev era for dealing with dissidents. Soviet authorities really didn't concern themselves with hassling ordinary Protestant believers until around the late 1970s, as several Protestant churches came to be associated with subversive nationalist movements in the Baltic republics, especially in Latvia. At that point, many congregations were infiltrated and placed under surveillance, but little effort was made to persecute or root out these churches at an institutional level. Not all religious believers in the Soviet Union were Christian, which brings me to the Jewish population of the USSR. I have talked a little about the history of Jews in the Soviet Union in earlier episodes already. Prior to the revolution, there was probably no more persecuted religious group anywhere in the world than Jews in the Russian Empire. They were subject to frequent official persecutions, unofficial pogroms with the tacit endorsement of the Russian state and church, and they were denied virtually all civil rights. Unlike other religious groups, when the Bolsheviks seized power, life actually got a little better for them. They were still subject to the same kind of attacks on their religious institutions as various Christian groups, but in this at least, for the first time, they were treated on an equal footing with other religious groups. As a community, things actually got better for them. They were granted some basic civil rights, and the law no longer made a distinction between Jews and Gentiles. They were allowed to move to cities and pursue higher education, careers in various professions, and do all kinds of things that were denied to them under the Tsarist regime. The revolution, however, did not destroy anti-Semitism, and Stalin personally harbored anti-Semitic beliefs. Jews were subjected to various veiled persecutions, especially after World War II and the foundation of Israel. As Israel drifted into the Western camp in the escalating Cold War, Stalin and the communists started to view their own Jewish population with increased suspicion. After the death of Stalin, Khrushchev did away with official anti-Semitism, and Brezhnev did not revive it. But anti-Semitic attitudes remained prevalent in Soviet institutions, and Soviet Jews were often denied advancement. Especially beginning in the late 1960s, a growing number of Soviet Jews sought to emigrate, especially but not exclusively to Israel. In order to emigrate, Jews were required to obtain an exit visa from the authorities. Before they could apply for such a visa, potential emigrants were required to quit their job. These exit visas were often then denied on the ground that applicants possessed some kind of sensitive knowledge about the Soviet state, that is, classified or secret information, and they could not be allowed to emigrate for reasons of national security. Then, having quit their job but still being stuck in the Soviet Union, these individuals were subject to the criminal charge of social parasitism, and were often incarcerated in prisons or labor camps. The plight of these individuals, who came to be known as refuseniks because they had been refused exit visas, was the subject of harsh criticism by the Helsinki groups that I talked about last week. As a result, their stories were highly publicized in the West as proof of the Soviet Union's cruelty and persecution of religious individuals. U.S. President Jimmy Carter and his successor Ronald Reagan would lead a campaign of international pressure against the Soviet Union to release the refuseniks. The final group I'm going to talk about today, which I've saved for last not because they're the least important, but because the discussion leads well into the topic I want to begin covering next time, is the Muslim population of the USSR. Muslims were the second largest religious group in the Soviet Union after Russian Orthodox Christians, making up about 1/4 of the entire population. The largest concentration of Muslims was in the Central Asian republics of Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan, as well as Azerbaijan in the South Caucasus. But the Russian Republic also had a Muslim minority accounting for about 10% of its population, mostly in Tatarstan and regions in the North Caucasus, such as Chechnya and Dagestan. The vast majority of Muslims in the Soviet Union followed Sunni Islam, the predominantly Shia Republic of Azerbaijan being the exception. From the outset, Islam was treated a little differently by the Bolsheviks than the various Christian faiths were. Unlike the Russian Orthodox Church, the Islamic faith had not been an instrument of state power during the Tsarist regime, and though it did have some foreign connection, unlike Catholicism, it was highly decentralized. It was therefore not seen as a major threat to the revolution, meaning the Bolsheviks could deal with it more gently. Further, Lenin recognized that Central Asia in particular had not been fully incorporated into the Russian imperial system, and still relied on Islamic law and custom for the daily functioning of society, things like marriage and divorce, the administration of justice, and relationships between various tribes and ethnic groups. Lenin was not keen to immediately overthrow this existing system without having something solid to replace it. So rather than suppress Islamic religious leaders, the Bolsheviks sought to ally with them and work with them as much as possible. That's not to say the Bolsheviks and later the Communists did not pursue secularization of the Islamic society. They did. They just generally did so more slowly than they did in the predominantly Christian regions of the Union. One of the major pushes made by the Communists relatively early in the Islamic regions was for gender equality, a core tenet of Marxism-Leninism, or at least something approaching it. Strict segregation of men and women, which was common in many Islamic societies at the time, was abolished. Education, healthcare, and other important areas of public life were integrated, with no separation or discrimination on the basis of gender. Polygamy, a practice common mostly among the old Islamic aristocracy in Central Asia, was outlawed as well. A little later, after Stalin was in charge and he felt that Central Asia was a little more secure and pacified within the USSR, the wearing of traditional veils by women in public was outlawed. The party organized public veil burnings by women as a celebration of their liberation. Later on, some educated dissident women in the predominantly Islamic republics would readopt the veil and wear it in defiance of the law as a symbol of anti-communist resistance. Stalin pushed a little harder to force secularization in the Islamic regions than Lenin did, even outright persecuting Islamic institutions. For instance, the number of active mosques in Central Asia sharply declined between 1928 and 1941. But he was generally more careful about it than he was in the predominantly Christian regions of the Soviet Union. He made sure that any persecutions were done by local party officials, and not Russians from Moscow. He was also always careful to couch the persecution in terms of suppressing some kind of treason, rather than simply calling it anti-Islamic. He took this care because he did not want to upset the rest of the Islamic world, with whom the Soviet Union's anti-imperialist rhetoric was often well received. Especially after the onset of the Cold War, Stalin and his successors wanted to keep Middle Eastern states as potential allies against the West, which also had strategic interests in the region. Khrushchev was a little more of an ideological purist than Stalin or his successor Brezhnev when it came to stamping out religion. Islam didn't really get any special treatment from his anti-religious propaganda pushes, though his campaigns of repression utilized mostly soft rather than hard power. Measures were taken, for instance, to make it much harder to obtain halal food that met with the dietary restrictions of observant Muslims. State institutions were directed to ensure that Friday, the usual Muslim day of prayer, was an ordinary workday, and that the weekly day of rest fell on another day of the week. Other bureaucratic and procedural tricks were used to undermine Islam's influence in public life. By the Brezhnev era, public life in the Islamic regions of the USSR was highly secularized. The Soviet authorities, however, had a much harder time secularizing private life, and Muslim religious practices remained common. It was not uncommon, for instance, for even party officials to carry prayer beads or attend some kind of religious services on their days off. Traditional Muslim burial practices were allowed in republics that were predominantly Muslim, like Uzbekistan, but were prohibited in other regions of the USSR, like Moscow. Muslims living there, however, when one of their family members died, still held burial services according to the Muslim tradition. By the Brezhnev era, even though it was illegal, this was generally accepted, and officials would usually look the other way unless they had another, usually corrupt, reason to target an individual involved. One constant concern that the Soviets had throughout their history was that religious nationalist or pan-Islamic movements from places like Iran or Afghanistan would spread across their southern border and influence dissidence or rebellion among their own Muslim population. As a result of this fear, a great deal of time and resources were expended to exert influence in these predominantly Islamic neighboring states. They did not want to force communism on them necessarily, but sought to keep them well within the Soviet sphere of influence so that the forces of Islam could be kept under control and the governments prevented from aligning with the capitalist West. One of the countries that the USSR worked very hard to maintain within its orbit was Afghanistan. And that will be the subject of my next few episodes. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, I want to give a big thank you and shout out to my patrons and supporters who support this show with monthly donations on Spotify and Patreon. If you're not a supporter yet and you want to be, you can support us with a monthly donation on either of those sites. Links to both can be found on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. Also on the website, you will find links to all of the show's social media, as well as a list of my sources for this week's episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. If you can't afford to donate right now, you can also support the show by subscribing and giving us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, which costs you nothing and helps to promote the show in the algorithm. You can also help by telling your friends about the show. I will be off next week as I will be traveling to my homeland in the Pacific Northwest to visit family and friends. I will try to produce some kind of special content while I'm away, but will not be producing a full episode of the podcast. When I return in 2 weeks, I will present the first of several episodes on one of the seminal moments in the decline of the Soviet Union, the Soviet-Afghan War. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.